significant drop, at least in the sort of early period of the lockdown. You know, traffic just literally fell away. You know, so we went from having busy roads to having literally roads with no traffic at all. I think, you know, badgers die in large numbers on the roads, particularly at that time of year, if you're looking at when the lockdown came in late March, early April. So we definitely saw reduced numbers of badgers killed, particularly for probably the first 6 to 8 weeks of lockdown when traffic has been very low. And, you know, that might benefit badger populations through the rest of the year, but it's difficult to say what the long-term impact of that will be. Other species would have benefited, hedgehogs and other animals that die in large numbers on our roads as well. In terms of the overall climate, it's been extremely dry. I think everyone who's involved in badger rescue and rehabilitation will know that, you know, we've seen lots of cubs that have needed rescuing. That badger mortality, particularly with cubs, would have been higher than it would usually be if it hadn't been so dry, particularly in April and into May, and temperatures being particularly high as well. So I think probably a bit of a respite because of lower traffic, but problems because of a dry, warm climate, which has obviously impacted on badgers. And I'm afraid to say that, you know, the persecution of badgers, and I'm hand over to Craig on this, has not stopped. You know, we've seen a few reports in recent weeks, particularly looking at what's been happening on shooting estates. The RSPB investigations has shown that there's been a significant level of raptor persecution, but we also know from, you know, the Hunt Investigation Team and other organisations on the ground that also includes foxes, badgers, weasels, stoats and other animals that will predate on ground nesting birds. So, you know, there's probably been pressure on the gamekeepers, you know, because of the potential problems that the shooting estates will face because of the economic situation we're in, to keep, you know, wild animals and raptors at bay. So, you know, while people have not been around keeping an eye on things, I think there's been a significant increase, and that's a worrying trend as well. But Craig might want to pick up on that. Craig, do you want to sort of come in on shutdown and wildlife crime?
Yes, certainly during the lockdown, the earlier stages, there was some thought as to wildlife crime, badger crime, that there was reduced impact. Right from the start, police forces weren't in the belief that badger diggers, badger persecutors were going to stay at home. Obviously, the main issue around the set blocking, which is a particular problem, autumn and winter, had finished virtually anyway because the hunting season had finished and the other aspects of that. So we saw in the earlier stages when less public were out there were less reports, but I don't think it was a case that crimes weren't happening. Certainly more recently, and normally April, May, June would be quieter times, quieter with regards to badger persecution. Again, partly because set blocking wasn't taking place, but certainly there's an increase in reporting, but I also think that's partly because of the work that we've been doing, encouraging people to report wildlife crime, badger crime, through the proper channels, and that the police are interested. Time and time again, a lot of people say, oh, the police aren't interested, they're too busy, it's not something really for them. Well, it is a matter for them if it's a criminal offence. And encouraging police forces, the training we've been doing with police forces up and down the country. 36 of the 43 forces are now have received training in badger crime, specific course detailed specifically for police forces. Yes, that training has stopped, but we're looking at picking that up. But it's certainly, with the whole situation is that wildlife crime does appear to be on the increase. Is it a true reflection? Can't really answer that. Are people more out there, more people using the countryside? People have got time to use the countryside, people have time to go and check badger sets. So naturally you would assume that some parties that we would naturally see an increase because people are actually reporting it. Certainly the ones on the roads, early days, was, as Dominic said, was typical this time of year. March, April, May, June, badger road casualties are at their highest. So it isn't unusual to see them. Various aspects are taken into account, and yes, as the traffic's increasing, suddenly we're seeing more road casualties, and that could be just down to the fact that there is more cars on the road. As simple as that. With territorial issues, sets, they will expand, they will move, and with the whole issue around their eyesight and everything else, we do see an increase this time. So, yeah, lockdown has made a difference, But has it really made a difference to the persecution of animals? And certainly when we're looking at some of the individuals involved, they haven't been staying at home. There's police forces have looked at ways of dealing with them, and obviously through the COVID regulations and everything else. But it's the hare courses, they're still out there. The people who are out there wanted deer poaching. The people out there are still there. They haven't gone away just because of lockdown.
So staying on that topic, you mentioned hare coursing. Obviously, Cambridgeshire is hot for that, unfortunately. I got some information from the police through the Freedom of Information Act last week and inquired about the wildlife crime incidents in the county. So since 2014, there's been 4 reported incidents under the Home Office Code of the Wildlife Crime 96. And non-notifiable offences since 2018 is only 18 cases. And in comparison to the hare coursing incidents, which since last year, well, since 2018, is 2,132. This is a huge difference. Does this reflect, do you think, Cambridgeshire as that it's safe for other wildlife and not for hare coursers, or does it reflect perhaps that the reports they're not being reported and people aren't monitoring enough and the police aren't hearing about them?
If I maybe just say, I'll hand over to Craig. Can I just because there's one interesting issue about the issue of hare coursing. I think obviously landowners are very concerned about hare coursing. Most local politicians. I remember we went to see Victoria Atkins as Home Office Minister to talk about sentencing, which we'll talk about a bit later. And she was very hot on hare coursing because it was an issue of concern to her constituents and local landowners in the NFU, and was very supportive of police action as wildlife crime. But when you got talking to badgers, badgers were not something she was too interested in. She saw them as a problem for bovine TB for farmers, and wasn't particularly interested in the issue of persecution. So I think that might reflect, that the sort of resources that the police force give to it, the political interest, and the concern of landowners to that particular aspect of wildlife crime. And it is unfortunate. It's not that hare coursing is not something that should be stopped, because it should. It's cruel, obviously, to hares, and it's something that shouldn't be allowed. But it is given a significant amount of focus and political activity and policing activity beyond other areas of wildlife crime, I would say, to a degree, even though poaching of salmon and poaching of deer and other things do get priorities as well. Craig, I don't know if you've got whatever views on that one.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The issues are that there's an awful lot of resources. There's money put into rural crime. Hare coursing comes under the rural crime. I know it's a difficult thing with wildlife crime. It is, it's both. Badger diggers, people who persecute badgers, they're much more secretive. Obviously, they're under the cover. They're usually under woodland cover or whatever. They're not in the open spaces, so they're not out in the open. There's a number of people who hare course. They arrive in vehicles. They're very brazen about what they do. They really don't care who's watching them. Where badger diggers tend to be more discreet about what they're doing. But of course, you've got to remember this fact that quite a few people who go hare coursing go out taking deer, they go out digging badgers. They aren't different people. So I think it's underreported. I think partly through fear. I think that fear element has been reduced somewhat with regards to hare coursing, but people are still very fearful of reporting badger crime, partly because obviously what might happen to them, but they're also not quite sure what those people are doing. Oh, it's just a few people with a few dogs. Oh, they've disappeared now. I won't bother. And the number of times I get people that contact me and say, well, I saw this the other day. It's been bothering me. Well, if you'd reported it, it probably was the fact that they're out after badgers. So they do come to Cambridge. They've always come to Cambridge. The figures nationally are lower for Cambridge, but I think that's partly because of the work of the badger groups, or the people down on the ground, the understanding. The police are interested, the Badger Trust is interested, the SECBG is interested. There's a lot of organisations that are interested in it. But yes, you're not going to get to 2,000 incidents, I'm sure, for badger digging, but I think it's very underreported. And at one point, we sort of looked at the figure, and it's very, very, it's 1 or 2%, maybe nationally, are reported incidents. So that's a massive hole where a lot awfully aren't. And when we're coming down the persecution side, most people don't report set blocking because, again, fear. don't want intimidation, don't want to report it, police aren't interested. The police may, some people say, well, the police are all sitting on one side. No, they're not, and they're quite clearly meant to be impartial. That's always one of the things we drive with any of the training courses. So it does happen. I think it's very underreported. It's not as bad as obviously hair coursing, and hair coursing is a massive emphasis to report hair coursing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how, as a group, do we build a relationship with the police in Cambridgeshire? I mean, they have the Rural Crime Action Team here. How would you suggest that we move forward with getting a good working relationship with them?
Well, some work I can do with the force. I know the wildlife officers. I know the team you're talking about, and it's certainly something which we are looking to increase. It's an area which Cambridgeshire has been in the past, which has always been, I won't say a low priority, but a lower priority within policing. You call them the Rural Crime Action Team. Their focus is towards rural crime. That doesn't mean that wildlife crime is not part of it. It just means that's a lower priority within some teams. You can look at different forces, the way they're structured, and you would like to think that Cambridge, there's other forces doing very well, there's other forces doing very poorly. There's some forces that haven't even got rural crime teams. So it's great that there is one. Work with them, deliver the training when we can get back to that, and that training won't be just for a small team. The training is offered to frontline staff, so your neighbourhood policing teams, even your community support officers, special constables, control room staff. There's a guide that's available for them. So we certainly need to work. Yes, have you had a meeting with anybody from the Rural Crime Team?
We haven't managed yet, no.
Okay, well, I can certainly probably help with that. And I've already made contact with an individual today, specifically. So I will build on that and obviously put your details to them so they can make contact. I would suggest that maybe an open meeting, an open discussion, decide, because it's very difficult for me to say what Cambridge should do or shouldn't do.
Yeah.
Because obviously they have their own policies. So I work with their policies. I'm not going to criticise them. My role is to work with them, support them, advise them where they do. And I get officers from all over the country, and I've had officers from Cambridge in the past. Do you mind me running this by you? And what I'm encouraged at, that's part of my role, is also encouraging the fact, well, you've got a neighbouring officer. Each police force is in regions, and the regions are there. An actual Cambridgeshire is represented on the UK Badger Priority Action Group, which actually is sitting next Tuesday. They are represented on that, so they've got an interest in badgers. So certainly worth a meeting with them and just saying and listening. Yeah, it's a good chance for them to listen, and it's a good chance for you to ask the questions. What's the best way of reporting? What would you like us to do? How would you like? And I think a local contact speaking to the group would be very beneficial.
Well, that would be great if we could get something like that sorted. I think that would be really positive.
I will deal with that. Yeah,
thank you ever so much. So moving on from that kind of wildlife crime, I suppose, and moving on to the badger cull, which is obviously one of the biggest disasters for badgers in this country. So first of all, despite COVID, DEFRA have said that it will go ahead this year, which is incredibly upsetting for many of us, or all of us. Despite a slight kind of, positive feeling about it being phased out, they have since announced that there will be some more zones in which the cull will take place. What at the moment is kind of the movement with the phasing out of the cull?
Well, we've been sort of thinking about this obviously quite closely over the last few weeks. There's been quite a lot happening during this sort of lockdown period. Firstly, just before we went into lockdown, the government finally came back with its verdict on the SECBG TB review, which took nearly 18 months for them to respond. You're right, the headlines, which the DEFRA press office were definitely pushing out to the mainstream media, were that, this is a start of the end of the badger cull, phasing out of the badger cull, a sea change in policy. We're going to move into badger vaccination, cattle vaccination, and concentrate on those cattle-based measures that we know are already key to getting this disease under control, better TB testing, movement and biosecurity controls. But it soon became apparent that, on one side they were putting that into the media, on the other we were still facing a significant expansion of the badger cull policy, at least in the next 5, 6, 7 years, for example. So, in the last few weeks we've seen 7 new supplementary badger cull licenses issued. Now, within the Godfrey TB review, the government could have chosen to not cull in any of those areas and move forward with vaccination, but it's just basically done a blanket approval of 7 new supplementary licenses after the end of 4-year culling licenses in Gloucestershire, Dorset, Cornwall, Devon, and a number of key areas. So that's going to increase badger killing, from the 1st of June. That's already taking place. We've also seen, as you said, that the government are not willing to even stop the expansion of badger culling during the COVID-19 pandemic, even though we, made it clear we had concerns about police resources, about the lack of monitoring by Natural England field operatives, and, concerns spreading the virus in terms of large numbers of contractors moving across the countryside. But, Lord Gardner, the DEFRA minister, wrote back to us very quickly under pressure from the farming and say that they were going to go ahead with it no matter what. We've now got a consultation on a so-called buffer zone arrangements to try and protect badger vaccination projects from culling, but really it doesn't do anything to protect badger vaccination projects. What it is doing is allowing badger culling to take place in the edge area. It's making the viability of badger vaccination projects, particularly smaller projects, very difficult to maintain and to develop. It's not giving the security to those badger vaccination projects, because the maximum buffer zone limit the government is willing to consider is 2 kilometres, and realistically you're probably going to need 7 to 10 kilometres to really put in any protection. And then we've got in the pipeline up to 10 new culling licenses, both in the high risk and in the edge areas and low risk areas. So we could see culling moving out of just the high risk areas. And that could mean, up to 51 licenses in operation by the beginning of September, another 50, 60, 70,000 badgers to be killed in 2020, which will take the total up to 160, 170,000. So this is catastrophic, really, in terms of badger protection in this country. We're in the process of sort of putting all our concerns together in an open letter to the DEFRA Secretary, George Eustace, on this issue, and then using that to get to all our groups and supporters so they can get their MPs to raise concerns with him, and to get the opposition to do that as well. Because we think everyone's really got to come back to this issue and hold the government to account. They're not being honest and straight about what they're doing. They've given the impression to the public and politicians at large that badger culling is on the way out, and a lot of people believe that. But actually, in reality, in the next 4 or 5 years, the situation could get far worse. And when I say far worse, that means that we could see another 250,000 badgers killed in the next 5 years. Add that to the 104,000, you can see the numbers start getting significant. We've also got a complaint before the Berne Convention that's been in place with the government since December, 6 months. They still haven't responded. The Berne Convention is a treaty that's of more importance now since we've left the European Union on habitat and species protection. We have the largest badger population in Northern Europe in England. So the government has particular treaty obligations under Berne to protect it and not to kill the badgers in such a way that they can't repopulate. So yes, it's not a good time, and we've got a lot of work to do. And we've got a new parliament since December, which most MPs have not really got used to the issues at all, or taken even any time to focus on it. We've had COVID that's kicked in. We've got an economy that's in free fall. So as you can imagine, this is a difficult time to get the policymakers and get the politicians looking at it.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's definitely not a good time for them. So what more can be done to raise awareness of the bovine tuberculosis issue with badgers and cattle? I mean, as far as politicians in the public, in the media, I mean, it's been 7 years now. What more can we do?
I think there's it is difficult after 7 years to keep this in the sort of level of media interest that we had. We still do well. If you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had, headlines on badger issues on numerous occasions over the last 8 to 10 weeks. So, if you consider other wildlife issues, with the exception of the international wildlife trade and its connections with COVID-19, it's largely been pushed out of the media agenda. So we've managed to keep it there. But it is difficult to get the sort of, interest and political impact that we would have got 2013, 14, 15 in the early stages of this policy. It's now been going for 7 years, and fatigue sets in. People sort of, you've got many other concerns. So I think all I would say to everyone, the Badger Trust has a role to play, and that's what we do in terms of trying to get it into the media and deal with politicians. But groups and your contact with your MPs, many of you will have MPs, to make sure you are relaying your concerns to them about policy. When we get the to George Eustace laying out all our concerns, get to your MPs, seek meetings with them, get them to write to the Secretary of State, you know, bring it up in your local paper, because media is still terribly important. Lots of local papers are really struggling to survive. You know, they're looking for stories, so get the badger cull in there, get letters placed, you know, campaign locally on the issue if it's coming to your county. So there's lots that we can do nationally and locally. We're trying to work more closely with the Wildlife Trust with some more success, because they're getting more involved in the vaccination side of things, and obviously to link up with the RTA that's been involved in this debate, board I work for as well, and other charities. So that sort of broader NGO which remains important. And yes, there is a need, I think, for the Labour opposition, which, to be quite frank, is far more credible under Keir Starmer now than it has been in the past, to up its game and to take this issue on. So we are looking at Luke Pollard as the Environment Secretary Shadow. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader, Labour Party, who I've had a lot of contact with over the years, is really keen to do more on badgers and animal welfare. So we've got some good people, but they need to sort of step up to the mark and put pressure on the government as well.
Mm. And what future do you see for the vaccination programme? I mean, it's doing quite well at the moment. Do you see it becoming more and more popular in different counties? Because obviously that's something that we're very keen on.
We've got a recent piece of commission peer-reviewed research that's been published looking at the operational value of badger vaccination, which is actually very useful. We'll share that with groups, but it's a good piece of research that shows basically that it is a viable non-lethal intervention method for lowering TB in badgers. But there are two critical factors. One is that the government needs to communicate its benefits far wider to the landowning farming community. And secondly, it needs to put more public money into it. Because if you consider how much has been wasted on culling badgers, over 50–60 million pounds, if you'd have taken half of that money and put it into badger vaccination, you would have secured a much more effective way of lowering the disease in badgers in a much more humane way. And it's been a huge waste of money, and scientifically it doesn't validate the policy, and it's very cruel. So we've got to try and push that resource element into badger vaccination. We have been saying to the government for quite some time that we want a national badger vaccination strategy, which when Michael Gove was Secretary of State, he was happy to discuss. He pushed us in to see civil servants. They came back and said, yes, we agree with most of what you're saying, and we want to see more money for training, more money for equipment. We want to put a communication campaign together by DEFRA to get the story out to farmers and landowners. Lots of good words, but not much action at the moment. Mm. Again, it's in the Godfrey Review and the response. So we're putting pressure on the government to say, you've got to do something about that as well. So badger vaccination is viable. It's got huge public support and political support, but the government have not been doing enough to give it the support that's needed.
Yeah. Once the cull is over, hopefully soon, what can we expect badger protection laws to look like? I mean, they're a protected species anyway. Can we expect any more protection for them? And I suppose this goes for other protected species that could be subjected to the same treatment.
I think Craig might want to come in on this one. I'll say just a few words. I think obviously the Badger Protection Act is a terribly important piece of legislation, and there's always concern that it's under threat. I know some farm groups have set up a number 10 petition at the moment to basically say it should be removed from the statute books. I don't think in the near future that's likely to happen, because it would be very difficult, a bit like the Fox Hunting Act, to sort of bring that piece of legislation through. But you know, there are ways of undermining the legislation, and the badger cull policy is definitely undermining the legislation. The lack of action on certain aspects of wildlife crime and building and planning development that threaten badgers is undermining the legislation. So I always say this to people: the badger is one of the most protected species in Britain, but also one of the most persecuted species in Britain, and I don't think that's going to change to a large extent. So I'll leave that there, but I'll just let Craig speak on that a bit more as well.
Okay. Yes, it certainly is one of the most persecuted, and the legislation is actually very good. There are some issues with it. Personally, I would hope that in some respects that it wouldn't change, because it protects the badger and protects its home, which obviously is one of the key areas which causes a great deal of conflict and talk. Certainly we want to see, there's been some questions about what are the problem areas. Some of your members might not know this, is that under the Badgers Act, the police officers do not have a power to enter land. They do under other legislation, they do under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, but under the Pacific, under the Badgers Act, a police officer does not have a power to go onto land, has to get permission. There has been some people that wanted that change. They wanted that gap, which has caused some issues in some parts. My opinion is it would be a very dangerous thing is to put forward changes into the Protection of Badgers Act to maybe introduce a power when potentially other things might be lost and they might be less protected. So at the moment, the legislation is pretty good. The licensing system, we may not agree with some of the licenses that are issued, but the licensing system works. It is a useful element to it. The legislation is clear: can't kill, can't take. The homes are well protected. I know there's various issues around current use and proving that the badgers are at home when the offence takes place and interpretations that have come out. But I don't think, personal point of view at the moment, from a training point of view, talking to groups and to the police, is that I wouldn't particularly be looking forward to a change in the legislation. I'd like to see it as it is, but all wildlife legislation is possibly going to be changed in the future, subject to the Law Commission, which was done 5 years ago. So we're already well behind, but legislation will change potentially. But specifically, Protection of Badgers Act, I'd like to see it stay as it is, really.
Okay. Thank you for that. So the last question we have on the cull, what conclusions do you draw, about the NFU losing its judicial review challenge against the government for the Derbyshire cull licences? As that was quite a big moment, really.
Yeah, it was, and not totally unexpected. As we found to our expense over the years, trying to overturn government decisions in court is extremely difficult. It is an interesting case, and I've got a copy of the judgment here because I've actually written an in-depth article for the Animal Law organisation, and that will be published soon, and I'll make sure everyone can see that via Badger Trust and other platforms. But I thought the lady concerned, whose name escapes me a moment, I'm trying to see her on my papers here, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, Mrs. Justice Andrews wrote a very good judgment, and what she did was capture the key legal decision-making processes that went on around that Derbyshire cull licence decision. Clearly, the National Farmers Union didn't buy the government's line initially when it took that decision on a Friday, before the licenses were issued for everywhere else the following Monday, where it basically said it had to look at coexistence of badger vaccination and badger culling in the county, and there was still more work to do, so it decided not to issue a licence. They thought it was down to Carrie Simmons, contacts I had with her in Downing Street, Boris's intervention. And on that basis, based upon speculation and coverage in the newspapers, they basically took court action. They also took court action because when Teresa Villiers, the former DEFRA secretary, was pressurised to answer that question at the Oxford Farming Conference in January, she did say that Downing Street had been involved, which is unusual. So the farming press just jumped on that and said, well, that must be something's behind it. So when you look at the judgment, to be quite frank, the NFU are absolutely right. Yes, it has Boris Johnson's fingerprints all over it. He did intervene on 2 occasions. Also, Zach Goldsmith, as DEFRA minister, and it definitely had an impact on the final decision-making process. Now, how much impact Carrie Simmons had on Boris, I think she probably had quite a lot, the way she works with him and the relationship they have. But ultimately, the Prime Minister is responsible for his own actions. What the judge said in the judgment was that the actual licensing conditions had been met by the contractors, and on that basis, they would be justifiably concerned and angry that they weren't given a license if the decision was solely made on those scientific licensing grounds. But she said that's not the case. They were also made on political grounds. And the politicians have to then decide the broader public interest involving, people that oppose the badger cull, which in this instance included the Badger Trust, the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and lots of other interested parties. What the impact would be if badgers that were vaccinated in Derbyshire ended up being killed, and that made the newspapers and all the negative publicity that would bring. So she said basically that every politician in that process had a legitimate lawful right to get involved up to and including the Prime Minister, and on that basis, she did not accept that this was unlawful, which again has sent the farming community ballistic, and they're now considering an appeal, but I'll wait and see if they choose to do that. So what I take away from the particular judgment is that this, and in the A-Law article I've written, I've said this has just got politics written all over it. I think it's a bit rich, and it was in the farming press, the Farmers Weekly editorial, when this judgment came through, was to say this was disgusting because, this is just a good example of how the government's put science to one side and taken a political decision. But and I know, and everyone on this call knows that the badger cull policy has been political from the very beginning. You know, and it's interesting at the moment, and I put this in the A-Law article, that we hear a lot from David King talking about the government's failures on COVID-19, you know, shutting down too late, you know, opening too early, putting, you know, the economy and ahead of public health. I'm not saying he's wrong on that. I think most of us would agree he's probably right. But it's a bit rich coming from David King saying the government's playing politics over, you know, science and the economy, when actually, you know, that's exactly what he did when it came to the randomized badger culling trial. Because if some of you who know the history of that, you know, the randomized badger culling trial went on for about 8 years, 50 million pounds, 11,000 badgers under the last Labour government. You know, Sir John Bourne headed up the independent scientific group that reviewed that policy, and, you know, basically came forward to say that badger culling had no meaningful contribution to make to lowering TB in cattle. That the way to deal with this was cattle-based measures. That would have been the end of the badger cull debate. We wouldn't have been talking about all badgers since, except that he intervened, basically undermined publicly at a select committee meeting in front of MPs the findings and work of John Bourne and his team, to say that he thought culling did have a justifiable place because they had hard boundaries and they did certain things. That changed everything in the debate, because when the Labour government lost, of course, in 2010, you know, David Cameron's team were already sold on the idea that culling did have a role to play, and it had a, you know, political benefit to them to play in the election campaign for rural voters, and hence this is where we are. So the point I'm making is that politics decided the outcome of the Derbyshire badger cull decision, but we shouldn't be surprised by that. And I think the judge was right to say that it has a place to be. And on a broader issue, you know, there's been a lot of nonsense written about the Prime Minister's spouse, partner, fiance shouldn't have any influence over the Prime Minister. Well, I didn't hear that, you know, when Dennis Thatcher had influence over Margaret Thatcher, or Sherry Blair had influence over Tony Blair, you know, or Theresa May's husband had influence over it. So I think my view would be this, that I think, you know, there are a lot of things wrong with Boris Johnson. But actually, one of the things that aren't wrong with Boris Johnson are the views of his fiancée on animal welfare, wildlife protection, and long may she have some influence in Downing Street, because we need it. So that's what I take away from that case.
Yeah, no, definitely. Long may she stay.
Yes, exactly.
So kind of connecting onto farming, really. I mean, obviously, farmland in this country makes up a huge percentage of land use, a scary amount. Do they need to fundamentally change for the sake of wildlife, the environment, and carbon emissions? What needs to happen, really, long term?
We've got to change. You know, there are a number of elements about our farming system that are failing. You know, with the COVID-19 restrictions, you know, the farming community, particularly the dairy, found itself in a crisis point where it was pouring milk down the drain. You know, all the food service companies and cafes, Costa and stuff are all closed, so they didn't have a market for their liquid milk. But that shows, you know, that you have a problem within the industry. What it's producing is undervalued. They're producing more than the market can actually take, and it's declining. You know, the value of the milk industry and you know is in decline. We have too many farms with too many cattle producing products where consumer is dropping. You know, we've got plant-based products which are significantly increasing in demand and quality and variety and price. So, you know, my view is that we can't continue to farm livestock in this country in the way that we are. Interestingly enough, Sir Ian Boyd, who was the architect of this badger cull policy, who resigned after, you know, spending 8 years as the chief scientist at DEFRA, shares those views, and I debated and discussed them with him recently. And you know, he's writing now about the need to move to a plant-based food economy, reduce significantly the level of livestock farming in Britain, you know, move to rewilding the economy, you know, to rewilding the land, which will help with carbon emissions being reduced. So there's so much, and you know, biodiversity and wildlife protection. We are the most nature depleted country in Europe. We farm our land in an intensive way that's had a hugely negative impact on the environment and wildlife. Where we do have a species like badgers that has increased in number because of protection that it needed under the badger protection, it's then fallen foul of an industry that basically pollutes wildlife and domestic animals by, you know, taking TB from intensive livestock systems and pouring it into the natural environment. And then as a consequence, we then go around and kill all the animals that have it, in the case of badgers. So no, I think fundamentally the industry is at a crossroads. I'm afraid the National Farm Union are not willing to change. And I sometimes get very exasperated personally. I know there's only 1 million people have signed that petition about, you know, food imports coming in from America, chlorinated chicken and things. I wish they were just as concerned, and 1 million of them would sign a petition about badgers. You know, chlorinated chicken, well, I just wouldn't eat chicken at all, to be quite honest with you, chlorinated or not, to a large degree. We don't need to eat it. Intensively farmed poultry in Britain or in America is not particularly good for animal welfare or the environment, chlorinated or not. And I think, we're getting too tied up in this debate about, the Americans will drive down our food standards. Well, our food standards are not very good anyway. And actually, if we're going to get serious about carbon emissions, we've got to reduce livestock farming. We've got to move more to a plant-based economy. And if that helps protect wildlife and stop badger culling, my God, it's got to be worth doing. That's my view.
For sure. No, totally agree. So another thing which needs changing really, but it's a difficult one, is with road traffic. We discussed earlier about how many badgers are killed on our roads, tens of thousands a year. One of the hardest hit mammals in this country for a multitude of reasons. What can we do to stop that? I mean, they already have wildlife byways, like tunnels underneath the road. I mean, an example in Cambridgeshire is the A428 near Camborne. They have, I think, 5 wildlife tunnels, but there's still dead badgers there every time I drive it. So what can we do and protest about to try and get this change?
I'll bring in Craig on some of this as well. My view is that, we constantly have a challenge with planning and development, and it's one of the most important areas for local badger groups, because if we don't have local badger groups, we just don't have connections with planning authorities, in local authorities, with ecologists and building developers, where we can do good work on the ground. It doesn't matter if it's a small housing development, it doesn't matter if it's a massive civil engineering project like HS2, we need local badger groups. Without them, there's no way we can even start to address these problems and these concerns. The legislation is largely not fit for purpose. Natural England is hugely under-resourced, and its licensing arrangements are getting weaker, not stronger. Its monitoring is getting weaker, not stronger. I know Craig will come back on some of this in a moment. And, yes, I'm afraid, again, we have laws, but they're not enforced to the degree that they should be. And, we look at the badger cull as being a major threat to badgers. Yes, it is. I'm not underestimating that at all. But actually, badgers are becoming increasingly under threat, through civil engineering projects, through, building development, through, out of town shopping centres like we've seen in Oxford, from increasingly busy roads. And, everything is about money and cost. And in an economy which is tanking, it's going to get harder to sort of justify, as far as, local authorities concerned, signage or building developers, underpass tunnels and things. But we must keep fighting for those, because it's not just badgers, obviously hedgehogs, who are increasingly at danger levels in terms of species decline, and other animals are under real threat from being killed on the roads and from development and other problems. And I think we've just got to look at this broadly and do more. And actually, some European countries, Scandinavian countries, have a much better record on this, and we can learn from it as well. But Craig, I know you're very involved in this now.
Yes, certainly development is having a massive impact across the country. It's one of the conflict areas. Something I did in the past, when I was the wildlife crime officer for Warwickshire Police, is I did a lot of work with the local planning authorities. And it's a key part to having this local contact. And to highlight an issue this week, we've had down in Cornwall, it's around a development, it's around a badger set, which there has been certain things put in place where potentially, if some people, local people, hadn't intervened, first thing they did was try and go to a local badger group. There wasn't one. There's possibly going to be one in the future. So working with Jackie at the Badger Trust office and myself, we've involved the police, although technically, the planning issue, it's not really a police matter. Obviously, protection of a species would certainly fall into that. But we've involved as many people as we can. So the local contacts, and as Dominic said about local groups, they're so vital. HS2 and the work that's going on there, the input from the local groups has been absolutely vital. And in some cases, what that does is prevent wildlife crime, prevents crimes against badgers, prevents the persecution, badgers being killed because people are out there dealing with things. So, it does have an effect. And certainly from a development point of view, I know planners are under extreme pressure to get planning permissions pushed through. But they've got to remember, and I always remind them, they have a duty under the Natural Environment Rural Communities Act to protect biodiversity. They have a legal duty. As far as we're aware, no planning authorities have been prosecuted for that, but it is certainly a threat that I would use and have used on many cases when speaking to planners. So, we're talking about road development. What can you do with road development? Birmingham Northern Relief Road, I worked in the police when that was built, and I can remember some of the massive problems we had with the badger sets and the bats and everything else. No different to what it is today with HS2. Much grander scale, much bigger, much larger, much bigger impact, but it still is. So yes, development of roads, whether it's underpasses or different considerations, we just want planning authorities to take badgers into account, take the ecology, take the wildlife, and consider it through their due process. And there is really no excuse not to do so.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. So moving on to our final couple of questions and topics. So thinking about the future now. So it's obviously very important to engage with young people, the next generation who are going to take over from us once looking after our badgers. So how can we encourage younger people to stand up for our wildlife and get involved in nature conservation and just educate them really on the importance of badgers and wildlife as a whole?
Yes, I think, I've spent a lot of my time. I know Alex White, I think his mum's on here somewhere. Debbie's on here. Alex's birthday today. I'm just going to say happy birthday to Alex White, and I think he's a great example. Hold on a minute, I'm still here. Sorry, I've just dropped off. So yeah, sorry, I'm still. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've just lost a second. Alex White is wonderful, and he's a good example of young wildlife ambassador that I've worked with alongside Bella Lack and James Miller and so many other people over the last few years. And the one thing that I found with this new generation of individuals who are really, really, out there speaking, writing blogs, speaking at conferences and seminars, writing books as Alex has with Get Your Boots On, is that they've just made such a difference. They've opened people's eyes to this next generation feeling so passionately about the environment and wildlife. And we need them. We need younger people to get involved in badger groups. We need younger people to, care about the future. And, we've seen it with the school climate strike movement. We've seen it with, everything around what's happening with regards younger people, not just in this country, but around the world, with what Greta Thunberg has helped to bring about as well. And people like Maya Rose Craig, if you've not come across her, who's also opening up the boundaries about discussions on race and equality, because that's another issue that we struggle with when we look at the Black Lives Movement at the moment. This is not an easy industry, if that's the word to use, to get into for many people, but particularly people from different ethnic backgrounds and social economic backgrounds, to work in wildlife conservation. That's an area that I'm also working on at Wildlife and Countryside Link as well. So, one of the best things that I've been able to do over recent years is just to work with younger people and to see them grow up. It's the last 5 years, they have grown up really fast physically, but they've impressed me immeasurably. And I feel very proud when I see them on Channel 4 News and things like that, talking so passionately and eloquently, or turning up on Spring Watch, talking so passionately and eloquently, or coming to, Bird Fair and doing panel debates and things that we've been working on over the years. So it's so important. And I think we just need to continue to engage young people and get them involved. Craig, I'm sure you'd feel the same, particularly on wildlife crime issues as well, don't you?
Yeah, certainly in all areas. I mean, one of my key areas has always been about education. It's not just educating the police, not just educating the judiciary, not just educating adults. That extends, and I've been doing some work with the chair of the Warwickshire Badger Group with regards to school education, the programmes on there with the Badger Trust themselves, and encourage police forces. And I know there's some work going on at the moment in West Yorkshire, where school packages, so working with schools, obviously very difficult in the current climate, but certainly the way forward. And certainly want to see, and you see time and time again, talks I've given to groups, it's mostly the older folk that are involved in it. And it's such nice to see and talk to an audience where you've actually got some enthusiastic teenagers, whatever age they are, of tomorrow, who are going to take this forward, because they need to. They need to take that. And the police forces, tomorrow's police officers, we need to do that. So the education through them, education has got a key part to play in preventing wildlife crime, educating people, educating all the different societies, getting the right balance.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, no, thank you. So our final scheduled question for today is going back to COVID-19. how do you think COVID-19, the pandemic, will change the world for better or worse? Not just for wildlife, but also habitat protection, climate change, and not just here, abroad as well. This is a worldwide pandemic. How do you think that it will play out? How do you hope that it will play out?
Well, I'll have a start at this first. I'm sure that Craig's got some views as well. But, to me, I think two things about the COVID pandemic is that it's a moment in time that will have significant impact on the world in terms of the environment, social, economic development for generations to come. This isn't just a blip event. If anyone thinks we're just going to sort of emerge back into a normal world in the next few months and it's all been forgotten, I think we're deluding ourselves. I think what it has done is raise serious questions about globalization. And I've grown up with globalization, and many people on this video call, and yourself, Ellie, and others have largely grown up with globalization and accepted the benefits of it, is that we're completely interconnected and we can move around, do everything we need to do at a drop of a hat. And I think what this pandemic has shown us is that's not going to be possible, in the future in the same way, and it actually carries serious risks with it. Some short-term benefits of what's gone on is firstly that we have reduced significantly in a very short period of time climate emissions. So we've seen like a 20% drop in carbon emissions in the month of May around the world on average. Overall, by the time we get to the end of the year, it probably might be around 10% reduction globally. And that's massive compared to anything we've been able to achieve during all of the discussions that have gone on since the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio and all the Kyoto Summit and Paris Accords and everything. To be quite frank, we've had loads of global accords and lots of people traveling around the world to global summits, but actually we've not been able to stop carbon emissions or even reduce them. They've just kept rising and rising. So by shutting the economy of the world down in the way that we have, we've suddenly managed to do something. And I think what the world now needs to think about is what it wants to do next. And that's not just for our political leaders, and God knows they are lacking in wisdom at the moment when you look at the sort of political leaders we're having to work with. A lot of this comes down to business and individuals. We've got to decide what sort of world we want to re-emerge back into. And, I'm going to see Michael O'Leary pop up, and drive me nuts regularly about the need to get back on a Ryanair flight and, buy me £3 gin and tonic and packet of crisps and off we go to Torremolinos or anywhere else we can go on a Ryanair flight. But the fact of the matter is, if that's all we're going to do again, we're not going to solve the problem. And all those planes are stacked up on the runway ready to go, but we've got to decide, do we want to go back to that? Yeah, we can get out there in our cars and we can stack those roads up and make them worse because we're not going to be on public transport. Or we can do things differently. I think there should be, in my view, a legal right to work for people who can work effectively from home. The one thing we found during COVID-19 is that people can work from home using the sort of technology we have here quite effectively. We don't need to be commuting in our millions in and out of cities. We don't need to be constantly going between meetings, clogging up roads and everything else. We can do things more online. We don't, as environmentalists, and I know many that I work with in Born Free and other organizations that are constantly traveling around the world to international conferences, we don't need to do that. We can do more in a way that we're doing this, and that will help the environment. It will also improve our lives, I think, because it will connect us back to the local communities, which has been a strength of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've started to take an interest in our neighbors and our local community again. And we started to look at wildlife in our local community because we've had to sort of restrict our movements. We don't need to go to California. We don't need to go to southern Spain to see beautiful wildlife. It's here in our doorstep. And COVID-19 has forced us almost to look at what's happening in our gardens and our spaces very close to where we live. And all of us who care about judges know about how important that local environment is. So I'm optimistic that a lot of that might stick. So we might change the way we do things. What worries me is that the world will make the mistakes it made in 2008 when we had the economic crash. Leaders like Barack Obama just became president and things, had a decision to sort of restart the world's economy by throwing massive amounts of money at it. But what they didn't do when they restarted it was say to companies like General Motors and things that will give you public money, but you must change the way you make cars. You must move more quickly to electric cars rather than internal combustion engine cars. We shouldn't make that same mistake again, but I'm worried that we will. If you look at the levels of public money that's been thrown at the airline industry, the agrochemical industry I used to work with, and other sectors that are all problematic when it comes to carbon emissions or wildlife depletion and chemical use. They've got masses of public money already, and none of that will be geared towards changing the way they work. It's almost like a lifeline to keep the economy going. And I've read this, I don't know if people can see this, but this book by Mark Linus, our final warning, 6 degrees of climate emergency. This has been one of the books I've read over the shutdown period, and it's absolutely shocking. Mark's a very good academic, but what he's done is he's taken all of the data from the IPCC and other peer-reviewed data and sort of written a very readable book looking at what will happen to the world over the next 20, 30 years as each degree of temperature increase kicks in. We're already on for 1.5, 2 degrees. Realistically, we're probably going to hit 3 degrees, 4 degrees by 2050. The way Mark tells us what that will do to the planet is absolutely terrifying. So some of the people, the young people I spoke about before, will grow up in this period of time, of parts of the world that are increasingly uninhabitable because of the heat, where you can't even grow crops, where people will move in them with tens of millions, where we'll have more disease, more famine, more conflict and war. And where we're beginning to already see the climate change. And just to finish from where we are, during this period of shutdown, if you look at the climate in Southern Europe, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the Mediterranean climate, the summer being elongated by a month, you know, because of climate change. We've already seen it. You know, you were having temperatures in Cyprus of 40+ degrees in late April, early May, in Turkey and Greece. They are temperatures that you would now and again hit, maybe in late August, September for a day or two. You would not be getting those temperatures the weeks on end in early May. We're already seeing the impact of climate change across Southern Europe and other parts of the world very, very quickly indeed. I know temperatures in the Arctic Circle were up at 31 degrees yesterday. We have seen those temperatures now and again in the past like that, but unprecedented over a period of time now. So yes, we've got a massive problem to deal with. I don't think we've got our heads around how quickly we'll have to change. The one thing we could do, to finish with from my perspective, is that lockdown has shown us that governments can intervene in our lives and stop us doing something to look after our own self-interest and the interests of others. We need governments to take similar action for climate change, where they will restrict our lives and change the way we live our lives because of the broader good of the children that are growing up now that will have to live in the world that we've left them. That's significant. It will mean it will change the way we work, change the way we eat, change the way we travel, and everything about our lives. But unless we're willing to do that, and unless governments are willing to force us to do it, I think the next 20, 30 years are going to be very, very difficult indeed. There you go.
Yeah.
Craig, I don't know what your take is on it.
Not so much, certainly is not as in depth as that. I mean, for me, COVID has had an effect, and it has put people in the countryside. It has raised people's ideas of what is out there. People have been asking questions. People have sort of said, well, I've never ever seen a badger in my life. I've actually now come interested, and I know there was the one lady's joined, I think it was the North Hants Badger Group recently, just simply never seen one in her life. Funny enough, never seen a squash one on a road, which is fairly unusual. But, you know, never seen one. So her interest was drawn because she's been out in the countryside and using it. So there's, you know, there are benefits from it. I think people are becoming more wildlife aware across the board, and for all species, not just badgers, you know, for all aspects of it. And just seeing comments on Facebook of people saying, well, I've been out and I've seen this. I didn't even know we had them in this area. So things like that are positives, and then they're wanting to learn. So people are, you know, I've had a number of people, an increase this year in people wanting to inquire about a wildlife crime awareness course that I've run in the past. So they just want to be aware what to do. And I work on principles sort of slightly away from COVID as such, sort of recognising, recording and reporting. I will offer to do any training for your group that any of your group wants, help as much as we can within the restrictions. But for me, what is a wildlife crime? So what is a badger crime? How do you record it? You know, for me, it's report them everything. You report if you think a crime is happening, 101, or online, report to the Badger Trusts, because there is a complex we unfortunately are in an age where we can't share readily information with the police. So if we're reporting it to the police, then I'd always say, can you please report it to the Badger Trust on the online form? I'm there, my email address is always available. People ask me questions day in and day out. You know, it might be about the fact that they've just seen a badger. What do I do? How do I help? But those sorts of things are key, and the future people do seem to be more wildlife aware, which is, I think, a positive step. But there is many challenges for our own wildlife on our own doorstep that we're facing on a daily basis.
For sure. Right, well, that's everything I have scheduled to discuss today. Thank you so much for answering all of them. There's some really insightful information there, so thank you. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Dominic and Craig?
To be fair to the HS2 team, about 2 years ago, we met with the sort of key ecology lead people in London at the early stages of the planning of the phase 1 route from London to Birmingham. And we made some good progress in talking about the need to work together to share information. And they did come and even speak at our Badger Trust Symposium 2 years ago as well about that area of work. Since then, of course, there's been a lot of political debate as to whether the project will go ahead or not, and what would happen with it. Well, now we've had decisions taken that it is to go ahead, and there is more work that's been speeding up on that phase 1 route. So what we've done is we've gone back in with HS2. We've had a number of meetings in recent weeks where we've got new contacts with the head of ecology team, a lady called Kat Stanhope, who's now set up regional meetings along the route with the contractors and ecologists, in the London area, in the Herts Middlesex area, in Warwickshire, Staffordshire, Buckinghamshire, Northamptonshire, West Midlands, up to Birmingham. All of the groups are now involved in those discussions. The idea is that we'll be able to liaise and understand what's going on the ground, get involved with site visits if needed. Craig is also involved in terms of any wildlife crime reports we have. And also we're going to be able to take information on all the set data confidentially from HS2 and understand exactly what badger sets they're working on or any changes we might need to make in some of that information. So all of that, I think, will be fundamentally important. The project is huge, it's complex. There are significant numbers of campaigners who want the project to stop. And the one thing I would say is you will see quite a lot of reports emerge on social media, and we need to check how accurate those reports are. There are certain individuals who just want to claim that things are being done all the time wrong because they want to stop it, and they're legitimate in just campaigning on that basis. From our perspective, the Badger Trust, we don't take a view, yes or no, as to whether this project should go ahead. What we've got to do is to work on the reality that it is, and that we have to work with the ecologists and contractors to make sure they meet the conditions laid out in the Natural England licensing, and that they understand and they make sure they take into account every measure that must be implemented to mitigate risk against damage to badger sets or harm to badgers. So there's an important job for us to do. There's an important job for the HS2 team to do. And we will get to grips with it as we go through each stage of the project. But I fully understand that there are many people out there, and I share, the deep concerns as to whether this project should be going ahead and all the harm that it will do to ancient woodland and other things going forward. Craig, do you want to say anything from your side?
No, well, yes, I will say something. On the grounds of the HS2 and the various stage, and obviously phase 1, I've been working with the 3 areas and the various badger groups. There has been lots of complaints, allegations, quite often unfounded allegations made of sets that have been interfered with inappropriately, rabbit warrens that are alleged to be the biggest badger set in the world, all sorts of things that the police have had to deal with. Now, each of the police forces that have the HS2 en route have liaison officers. Sometimes that does sit within the wildlife crime departments if those police forces have one, and they are keeping a close eye on it. They are well aware of the fact that there are people who will exaggerate circumstances, but they are looking at it. And I've been working with a number of police forces, I've been out to sites to see a number of incidents. And yes, I can understand the concerns. I'm not saying that everything is smooth and running nicely and nobody's bending the rules, but at least they know that the police and various badger groups are on their backs and watching them, and they are being watched. It's causing a greater inconvenience to HS2. Well, that's one of the things they're going to have to put up with if they're going to build such a massive construction project, which is going to affect numerous species. And it's not just the badgers, it's the various other species. So as far as I'm aware, as yet, there is no prosecution for any part of phase 1. Prosecutions have been considered, when the evidence is looked at, is simply not there. So yes, keep reporting them, and I'm quite happy to encourage people to report them or ask me questions about them. But quite often it's I've found a grid, it's over this rabbit warren. Well, the reason it's been put there is to stop the badgers getting in, not the badgers getting out. They don't want, obviously, because then the bulldozer comes along, so they've got to stop as much as they can. So the licensing system with Natural England is very strict, but again, I'm not saying this isn't abused, bent, twisted, but the fact is that people are looking at it day in and day out, and that's what we need to happen.
Yeah, thank you. It's a difficult one, really. I'm worried the whole Brexit thing is now going to get caught up in the COVID-19 economic collapse. It couldn't really come at a worse time. If you were writing a thriller about the world going to complete meltdown, and you said that you had COVID-19, Brexit, civil rights problems in America that then spill out quite rightly to broader concerns about civil rights and racism in other countries, but also causes more concerns about social disorder. All of this, at a time when, we've got climate change just sort of burning away for reality. It's quite shocking, really, and quite worrying. So I think the situation with Brexit doesn't really make much sense in many ways. In some short-term areas, it might help to deal with problems, for example, like live animal exports, which is something the government has said, and Boris Johnson has been very committed to personally, to stopping. And I think there's a belief that, leaving the European Union would allow that trade to be ended, and that in turn would allow the vaccination of cattle, which is now part of the response to the Godfrey Review, to be speeded up. And I think that could be something positive that comes of Brexit. We might see some positive moves on the British government having more control over its foreign aid budget and using more of it to do international wildlife conservation, climate mitigation work around the world with the 13 billion a year that it has. I think that could be a benefit that we might see arising from leaving the European Union. I'm not certain about fisheries policy. There's arguments on both sides that, we might be able to have more control about our fisheries and more control of our marine environment. And that could improve things, but it could go either way. Will it mean that our farming systems are more sustainable, animal health is improved, our climate emissions will be reduced? I don't think there's any, in my view, good evidence to show that's going to be better outside of the union than in the union. The farming system as it stands at the moment has a significant amount in terms of billions of pounds of EU subsidy every year under CAP. The government can't replace that money like for like. So the farming industry will have to be smaller and less subsidized as a result of leaving the European Union. If that means that we have fewer livestock farms and we get a movement toward more rewilding and plant-based economy, that will be a good thing. And if Brexit sped that process up, then I'd welcome it. But I don't see the evidence from the government's commitments at the moment that necessarily is going to happen. So the jury is out. But I think short-term Brexit could cause more economic problems on top of economic misery that COVID-19 is causing. So it's difficult to know. I don't know, Craig, have you got any views on Brexit and animal issues?
Just really on the legislation itself,
yes.
There were some concerns that coming out of Europe would weaken or lessen the effectiveness of legislation. Protection of Badgers Act, as far as badgers are concerned, is a British piece of legislation. It hasn't changed. As far as we can see, that no legislation, yes, over time things might change a little bit with statutory instruments and things, but as far as the legislation is concerned that protects our wildlife, we don't see any changes. The rulings are going to be the same, the definitions are going to be the same, the sentence is going to be the same. So we don't see any change because of Brexit, and I'm talking about the legal side.
First letter, I think, should be about bovine TB policy. I've no doubt about it, and about what is happening, as we talked about earlier, about the government saying one thing and then doing another when it comes to killing badgers. Second one, I would say, should be about getting serious public funding support to badger vaccination. As a big society in action, we can go out there and we can work with landowners and farmers to vaccinate badgers, and we should be doing it. The third one, I think, should be to say that cattle vaccines should be pushed forward more rapidly. A commercial trial in Britain to prove that cattle vaccination alongside badger vaccination can work. I think we need to see the fourth one about recordable wildlife crime, to make wildlife crime recordable in the same way human crime is recordable. So police have to benchmark success in dealing with wildlife crime actions. And I think the last one I would say would be to, you know, come back to what I said earlier, that the farming industry needs to change. And I think the government needs to accept that intensive livestock farming is not good for public health, it's not good for the environment, it's not good when it comes to climate change, and we should be moving away from these outdated, outmoded farming systems. And if that means that COVID-19 and the dangers of livestock industry spreading disease, or if it's Brexit and the fact that there's less money for farmers anyway, we should move in the direction of away from intensive livestock and dairy production. That's what I would say are worth flagging up. I hope that helps.
Great.
Craig, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on letters. That's 5 from my side.
I mean, from a legal point of view, recordable wildlife crime, for those who don't know, Home Office record crime. So if somebody has their card stolen, it's recorded and it's a Home Office statistic. As it currently stands, that wildlife crime, apart from 2 offences and they're not in relation to badgers, are not recordable. There is a paper that's been submitted, and certainly any support towards that and getting it recordable would help, because that makes it accountable. It's very difficult at the moment when I go to a police force and say, what are you doing about wildlife crime? What are you doing about badger crime? When they turn around and look at it and say, well, actually, we haven't got any. According to the Home Office, there isn't any. It's the statistics that badger groups record, the RSPCA records, the Badger Trust record. It's all the individual organisations, and this is the issues with the freedom of information requests. A lot of police forces can say, well, we haven't got any, because they don't actually, according to the Home Office, have to record it. So wildlife crime is recordable. Sentencing guidelines, another key piece of work, which which I work with, which Dominic does, is looking at sentencing guidelines. So trying to get proper sentences, appropriate sentences for wildlife crime and badger crime. So you've noticed, apart from obviously the coal ones that Dominic mentioned, those are 2 key areas that I would look towards.
Yeah, it's difficult. We know that many species, you know, I said earlier on that Britain has one of the most nature depleted environments in the world. We know that lots of species are under real threat in this country, from turtle doves to nightingales to hedgehogs. It's not at the moment the case that badgers are under threat. The point we're making to the government, though, is if they continue to cull them on the scale that they are, they will take an animal that has done relatively well from protection and from the environment that, to a degree, we've created for it in certain parts of the country where it can increase its population, and we've just hammered it in a very short period of time, to a point, I use this phrase a lot, that this is the biggest destruction of protected species in living memory, and we're pushing it to the verge of local extinction in areas of the country where it's lived since the Ice Age. And I think we've got to keep making that point. We could see in Britain a situation where we've got the largest population of badgers in Northern Europe decimated within a decade, from 2013 when this policy started to 2023. If I looked at those 10 years, we could have taken down 350,000+ badgers. At the same time that badgers are dying on the road, same time that persecution and planning and problems about building are killing badgers, the same time that climate change is making our springs much drier and warmer so that cubs are not surviving in the numbers that they would have done in the past, in the same time that road use is growing so that we're killing more badgers on our roads. It's not a good picture. So I think, the minute you talk about badgers to lots of people in the farming landowning community and many politicians, they jump up and down and say we're being overrun by them. Why do we need to worry about it? I think you've just got to keep coming back on those wider issues. That if you have a healthy population now, it will not be the case that you'll continue to have one. And we hear a lot of discussion about coexistence of badgers and hedgehogs. The only reason that hedgehogs are declining is largely down to man. As we know, it's the hedgerows being cut, it's the trimmers that the local councils use, road deaths, slug pellets, pesticides, all those issues are clear. We know those are historically what's led to that massive decline. And yes, they do, compete for food in the same area of land. So if there's a massive decline in hedgehogs because of human activity, then anything that the badger takes will have a bigger impact on the overall population that's left. That's the problem. If the population was healthy, whatever the badgers took wouldn't have an impact. As it stands at the moment, because the population of hedgehogs is in massive decline, you know, arguments can be made that anything the badger takes makes that situation worse. So, you know, I think we've got to be very, very cautious about, you know, what we do with nature and how we impact on one species to another. And that's the point I would make. I do think that, you know, there is a serious danger to the badger population, and I think we need to continue to address that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you ever so much. So if that's everything that everybody has to ask, please feel free to speak up now if you have anything else.
Then I'd just say thank you, Ellie, because I think you've done an amazing job, so well done. I know you've really worked hard organising this and taken some time off work today to prepare it with the questions and set up. And I hope this will lead to other similar events with badger groups across the country, because I think it's a good way of us engaging. And myself and Craig are very open to doing these with other groups. If anyone's out there from other groups and wants to do a similar debate discussion about these issues, how broad they can be, as we've covered a lot of ground today. But yeah, it's been great. So thank you so much, Ellie, for your time. And I wish every success to your new badger group. And I hope you might get a few more supporters as a result of tonight's activities as well.
Thank you. I certainly hope so. And thank you both for attending. It's very kind of you to take time out of your day to do this. So thank you.
Not at all. And just one last thing. Tomorrow, Craig, I know you'd probably want to say thank you as well, don't you, before we go?
Yeah, just anything I can do to help the group, individuals, any questions that people have, if they're just not sure. All I'd say to people is report it, by all means. You know, drop me a line if you've got a query, but don't worry about asking a silly question. Yeah, I've done 35 years with badgers. I've had lots of silly questions, partly coming from me, myself, to other people. The only one way of learning, but we need to help and support each other. So training, I can help for that. But individual questions, I don't mind. An email is easy to answer. You may not get, I only work a restricted number of hours with the Badger Trust, but I'm always willing to do it virtually 7 days a week. And I will get back to people. If it's a long convoluted question, then I will respond to it at some stage. If it means liaising with Cambridgeshire Police, then I will do so. But it obviously takes a little bit longer.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Ellie. It's been great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody who came along. It's been a good turnout. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you to everyone out there. Take care.